In the last lecture, we concluded with the Sanhedrin's conviction and condemnation of Jesus, and then with Peter's 3 denials of Jesus. Now, in chapter 15, verse 1, it says, "As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate." Now, that consultation is basically saying that the greater Sanhedrin was meeting with the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. So there could have been, if the greater Sanhedrin consisted of 71, there might have been maybe 100 people there present. And it seems that this meeting, as soon as it was morning, was essentially for the single purpose of deciding the most expedient way of getting rid of Jesus. Now, it was certainly necessary that the high priest, as head of the Jewish state, should have the assurance that all of the officials within Judaism agreed with what had been done. So one question, they did not legally have the right to execute Jesus themselves, although, as we know, for example, from Acts 7, sometimes the Jewish leaders acted extrajudicially. Acts 7, when they stoned Stephen to death. But the Sanhedrin and the other leaders decided to deliver Jesus over to the procurator, Pontius Pilate, since only Pilate could legally order Jesus' execution. Now, there were probably a couple of reasons, or some reasons behind this, in addition to his having the legal authority. Having the authority of Pilate and the government would be important in quelling any popular outcry that might arise on Jesus' behalf. And furthermore, a verdict from Rome against Jesus, and especially the shame of death by crucifixion, would severely damage any attempts on the part of Jesus' followers to rehabilitate him. But the Jewish leaders evidently decided not to inform Pilate of their own trial of Jesus by the Sanhedrin. And the reasons probably were that if they disclosed the proceedings that had taken place before the Sanhedrin, the illegality of it would be obvious to Pilate, because he would have known, according to Pharisaic law, that the trial could not legally take place by night. Pilate also, if he knew of the trial before the Sanhedrin, would want to know what the offense was that Jesus was convicted of. Well, it was blasphemy, and Pilate wouldn't care anything about that. And so he might start asking awkward questions, and complications might arise. And in fact, Pilate might immediately quash the conviction and release Jesus and let him go. So they evidently decided it would be better to say nothing about our own proceedings and just take him to Pilate and accuse him there. And so the Jewish leaders had to, therefore, bring a new charge against Jesus that would interest Pilate, because the charge upon which they convicted, namely blasphemy, meant nothing to Pilate. He didn't care. But the new charge against Pilate, against Jesus, brought to Pilate, would have to be something that he would be bound to deal with, and something that, according to Roman law, would carry the death penalty. And so their subsequent actions show that they essentially agreed they would accuse Jesus of high treason against the emperor, and Pilate would be bound to take notice of that. They probably thought if Pilate shows any signs of wanting to release Jesus, they would stir up the people to the point that they would say, if you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. So So he would render himself, Pilate would render himself liable to recall to Rome for suffering a rival to Caesar to exist in Judea. Now, one writer points out that although the Jewish leaders seem to want to bring a charge of high treason against Jesus, it is unlikely that Jesus was actually condemned for high treason, because there is a book by Emperor Justinian. Now, Justinian was writing about 500 years later when he was emperor, but he cites authorities, including people from Jesus' time and shortly thereafter, about all of the examples of what constituted high treason, and most all of them involve serious violence against the state, or plotting the death of the emperor, plotting to assassinate a Roman official, raising an army, all of these kind of things. Jesus met none of those things. He was a man of peace, not a man of war. And Mark 15, verse 10, says that Pilate knew that Jesus was being handed over to him out of envy, and Pilate wanted to free him. And Mark, Luke, John, and Acts all indicate that. He acceded to the demands of the Jewish leaders simply for matters of political expediency. And so now let's take a look at the trial before Pilate, which is found in chapter 15, verses 2 through 15, which says, Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priest accused him of many things, and Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with this man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out, "Crucify him." And Pilate said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him over to be crucified. Now, the question in verse 2 that Pilate asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" is like the question the high priest asked Jesus in chapter 14, verse 61. Namely, it was actually a statement with an implied question. It literally is worded in the Greek, "You are the king of the Jews." Aren't you? Isn't that right? And so, as with the case with the high priest, Mark's wording makes Pilate the unknowing confessor of who Jesus really was. So, out of the mouths of Jesus' enemies, they unwillingly confess who he is. Now, the basis for Pilate's question is found in Luke's account of the trial. Luke 23, verses 1 and 2 say, "Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.'" And now Jesus' response to Pilate's question, it's, "You have said so." It emphasizes the you. You have said so. It's not a direct affirmation, because if he directly affirmed that he's a king, then Pilate might have ordered his execution then and there. But it's basically, but it's not a denial either. Now, his reply kind of suggests you would do well to consider the question. Now, the chief priests knew that their allegation that Jesus was forbidding people to give tribute to Caesar was false. since they attempted to get Jesus to say just 2 days before, should we pay the tax to Caesar or not? And Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. They also knew that their allegation that Jesus was saying that he himself is Christ a king was false, because he was condemned by the Sanhedrin precisely because he did not claim to be a political Messiah, but claimed that he was not a political Messiah, but was the divine Son of God. Therefore, but now essentially they're saying he's claiming to be a political rival to Caesar. Now, what Jesus was saying in saying, you've said so, and by not answering any more questions, he was in effect saying, in answer to the charge, yes, I'm a king, but not the kind of king I'm alleged to be. But I'm not a king who's a rival to Caesar. I'm not guilty of treason against the emperor, but I have come to found a kingdom that is not an earthly one. And John's account of this trial makes that clear. Now, since Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, and it was only handed over to him because of envy, Pilate attempted to release Jesus based on the custom of releasing one prisoner. And so he said, should I release the king of the Jews? And so, as with so many other things in Jesus' life, there's great irony to all of this. Jesus was charged by the Jewish leaders with being a political king, a charge they knew to be false. Pilate condemned him to death, even though he knew that Jesus was innocent, while at the same time, Pilate released the man he knew to be guilty. It's just, these trials are absolutely amazing and ironic, both in terms of procedure and of substance. Now, John's account of the proceedings show even that the Jewish leaders and the people abandoned all pretense of loyalty to God, but gave their ultimate loyalty to Caesar. John 19, verse 12 says, from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Then John 19, verse 15 adds, Pilate said, should I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. And so then Matthew, in Matthew 27, records even one step further. When Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water, washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. And the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. In other words, they were invoking on themselves the same kind of anathema, the same kind of curse that Peter had invoked on himself when he denied Jesus. This is absolutely amazing, the depth to which they went. But the ironies don't end here, because Barabbas means Son of the Father. Now, Jesus is the true Son of the Father. So, a convicted murderer is set free, and in his place, the innocent Son of the Father is condemned to death. This is a clear example of the substitutionary atonement, because we actually are all very much like Barabbas. Barabbas was imprisoned as an insurrectionist and a murderer. So we are imprisoned in our sin as rebels against God and his law, and have committed self-murder through our sin, and have brought sin and death into the world. And just as Barabbas had been condemned to death for his crimes, so we have been condemned to death for our sin. But just as Barabbas had nothing to do with his own salvation, it was all based upon entirely Pilate's grace and Jesus' death, so we have nothing to do with our salvation, but have been saved entirely by God's grace, since Jesus bore the penalty for our sins. Then after that, it says that the soldiers led him away inside the palace. They called together the whole battalion. They clothed him in a purple cloak, twisted together a crown of thorns. They put it on him. They began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they'd mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Now, this mocking and beating of Jesus by the soldiers replays the treatment that Jesus earlier received by the Sanhedrin. Purple was the most expensive and prestigious of the ancient dyes, and it symbolized royalty. Jesus bore the soldiers' scourging, beating, and mocking in fulfillment of Isaiah 50, verse 6, and Isaiah 53, verse 5. So again, what we have seen here is that multiple Old Testament scriptures and prophecies are fulfilled in these events of Jesus. Now, this leads to the crucifixion and death of Jesus. The crucifixion and death and burial are found in chapter 15, verses 20 through 47. I will summarize this because it's a rather lengthy passage. As they led him to crucify him, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry the cross. They brought him to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And by the way, it's also called Calvary, which is from the Latin, which also means skull. They crucified him, and they divided his garments among him, and the inscription said, "The King of the Jews." They crucified him between two robbers, and then he was derided by the crowd. When the 6th hour came, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders thought he was calling on Elijah. But then it says, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Now, women were looking on at a distance, and when evening came, since it was the day of preparation, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, went to Pilate, asked for the body. Pilate was surprised that Jesus was dead already. He summoned the centurion, who confirmed that Jesus was dead, and then he granted the corpse to Jesus. Joseph brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, laid him in a tomb that had been cut from rock. He rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb, and Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Now, in the book, I list at the beginning of this section 18 specific aspects of the crucifixion, death, and burial of Jesus that fulfilled Old Testament scriptures. Now, we need to understand the crucifixion was not a private event. It was a public event involving Roman government officials, the Jewish leaders of the Sanhedrin, the common people, Jesus' friends, his foes, his mother was there, and of course Roman soldiers. Now, in other words, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is one of the most well-attested events in history. And for the evidence of the historical and biblical evidence of the crucifixion, that it is a historical fact, you can take a look at our Eclesia book on Christianity and Islam, on the evidence for that. And just one, little pointer. It talks about Simon of Cyrene was made to carry the cross. He is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, there's no reason for the author to include such names unless the readers knew or could have access to them. Mark is basically saying, Alexander and Rufus will vouch for the truth of what I'm telling you, and if you want to, go ask them. So again, this account has all the evidence of trustworthiness. Now, crucifixion was a punishment reserved for non-Roman citizens and slaves and violent criminals and prisoners of war. Excessive cruelty was unleashed, and to enhance the shame, victims were executed in public, and men were normally crucified naked. And the soldiers gambling for Jesus's clothes verifies that. In fact, John 19 specifies that the soldiers took both Jesus's outer garment and his tunic, or his inner garment, which means he was indeed crucified naked. Now, there's something important about, there's a number of things important, but one important aspect of that is the fact that, think about this, Jesus was a grown man in his 30s. His own mother was at the foot of the cross. Jesus is nailed to a cross where everyone can see his private parts. In other words, he gave everything he had. The only possession he ever owned were the clothes he wore. They took those away. In other words, he gave his life, but he also gave his shame, because that is what it took to save us from our sins. Everything he had, including his shame. That was the depth of what's going on in the atonement. Now, Jesus' crucifixion on Golgotha was outside of the city gate, according to John 19, verse 20. Now, this also has theological significance. Hebrews 13, verses 10 through 12 says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tent have no right to eat. For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as a sacrifice for sin are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood." And Numbers 19 talks about the ashes of the red heifer. It shall be taken outside of the red heifer, taken outside of the camp and slaughtered before the high priest. Hebrews 9 alludes to this when it says that Christ entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing us eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So again, all of these things are showing they were types and shadows, always pointing to Jesus. So even the outside of the gates of the city was the fulfillment of Scripture. Now, Jesus' cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is pregnant with meaning. The judgment of sin is eternal separation from God, known as hell. And hell is described in various places in the Bible as outer darkness. So when the sky turned dark while Jesus was on the cross, that was a sign of God's judgment on the sin that Jesus was bearing. And the darkness was symbolizing the outer darkness of hell itself. And since hell, the essence of hell is eternal separation from God, when Jesus cried, my God, why are you forsaking me?" that shows he was experiencing hell itself. And as I said in an earlier lecture, he didn't experience just one hell, but millions of hells. Millions of eternities in hell were all compressed upon Jesus into the time he was on that cross. That's beyond my ability to comprehend. But again, that is what it took to save you from your sins and to save me from mine. It is beyond our comprehension. No one else could ever possibly do that. But also, his cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" reveals his perfect obedience. Throughout his life, Jesus never did anything on his own, but several times in the book of John says he only did what the Father showed him. And now he basically is saying, I trust you, Father. I believe in your plan for salvation of lost souls. And I love you so much that I will obey your will completely, even though it means complete separation from you and having to endure the combined hells of sinful humanity. And Jesus did it all voluntarily. As Isaiah 53 verse 11 says, out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see it and be satisfied. In other words, what the cross shows us in a way that no other religion even hints at is how valuable we are to God. He suffered and eternal hell, and yet he looks at us and says, it was all worth it. He loves us that much. Now, again, in earlier lectures, in other contexts, I've sometimes put together what is said about a particular event by all of the Gospels. And here we see that with the writing of Pilate. Mark says the substance, the King of the Jews. Matthew has, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Luke says, this is the King of the Jews. And John says, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. These do not contradict each other. When we put them all together, the full statement read, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now, interestingly, although he may not have realized it, Pilate again was confessing in writing in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, according to John 19, for all to see the truth of who Jesus was. But the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the chief priests, they objected. They knew what it was saying. And that's why they said, you should say, he said. But Pilate said, nope, what I've written, I have written. Now, the death of Jesus, two events signify that, and they're both important. The two events were the rending of the veil or curtain in the temple and the confession of the centurion. Now, there were two veils in the temple. One in front of the holy place where the priests could enter, and the other veil was between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Now, first century historian Josephus saw mystical significance in the first veil, that it was kind of an image of the universe. But in Exodus and 2 Chronicles, it says that the holy place and Holy of Holies are separated by a veil of blue, purple, and scarlet. It's not clear which veil is being referred to. There's evidence from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The wording used is similar, refers to the curtain before the Holy of Holies. On the other hand, only the outer curtain was visible to the people, and so it may be that the centurion saw this. So it's not entirely clear which veil is referred to, but regardless of which, the meaning is the same. The tearing of the curtain symbolized the destruction of the temple and the free access that people now have to God through Jesus Christ. And in fact, Hebrews 10, verse 19 and 20 say that we now have confidence to enter the holy places by a new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, which, verse 20 says, the curtain was his flesh. So everything here is symbolizing that the whole temple, including the veils, were always pointing to Jesus Christ, because Christ is the true temple. Remember, at the Last Supper, Jesus said he was inaugurating the new covenant in his blood, and now the entire Old Testament system has been rendered obsolete because of the one sacrifice that he has made. The centurion in verse 39 said, truly this man was the Son of God. And so, whereas the high priest and Pilate had called Jesus the Son of God or the King of the Jews, they were mocking. This centurion was telling the truth legitimately. And verses 40 and 41 talk about the women who followed him. Now, think about this. The centurion was a pagan Gentile, and as such he was an outsider and considered unclean by the Jews. The women were generally marginalized and considered second-class citizens by most male Jews. What this is telling us, the verses 39 through 41, is that it's often the marginalized and outsiders who exhibit the greatest faith among those whom God works. Now, we will, in the final lecture, we will talk about Jesus' burial and then his resurrection. And I want to include the burial with the resurrection because they go together and they are important.